What is going on, everybody? What is going on, the Catch fam? My name is John Dawson, and in today's video we are hopping into our starts and sits at the quarterback position for week 2 of the 2022 fantasy football season. If you guys do enjoy today's content, be sure to hit that like button on the way and hit that subscribe button. Of course, if you are new to the channel, we put out free daily fantasy football content. Be sure to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. Starts, sits, trades, waiver wire, quarterback position, running back, tight end, receiver, defense, kicker, whatever it is you guys need, I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Without further ado, let's hop into today's video. All right, Thursday night football, we've got the Chargers at the Chiefs. There's really no question about it. This is probably the easiest slide of the entire night. You are starting Patrick Mahomes without a doubt. What a monster performance in week 1. The #1 quarterback in fantasy football overall. 360 passing yards off 39 passing attempts, 30 completions, and 5 touchdowns. He did have a fumble, but who really cares? It did not matter. Just an absolutely amazing day all around for Patrick Mahomes. Without Tyreek Hill, it did not matter. This offense looked absolutely electric. Just under 34 fantasy points on the day. On the other hand, we had Justin Herbert, who put up a very solid performance as well. QB5 on the week. 179 passing yards for Herbert, 3 passing touchdowns, which netted you just over 23 fantasy points, and he did it without his #1 receiver. So I love this matchup overall. Both these quarterbacks are going to have fantastic days. There's no doubt in my mind Patrick Mahomes and Justin Herbert are both starts moving into week 2. All right, moving into the 1 o'clock games on Sunday, we've got the Patriots at Steelers. Really no doubt in my mind you are sitting Mac Jones and Mitchell Trubisky, basically the opposite of the first slide we just went over. And Mac Jones is more than likely still going to be dealing with an injury, even if he is able to play. Did not get to play an entire game in week 1. Ended up with just over 8.5 fantasy points. Really not a great performance while he was in the game. 213 passing yards, 1 passing touchdown, but an interception and a lost fumble. At the time that I'm recording this video, he has been able to practice, but I do think outside of very deep super flex leagues, there's no reason to start Mac Jones, and I really don't think there's much reason whatsoever to start Mitchell Trubisky as well. He netted you just over 12.5 fantasy points last Sunday. Did throw a score, did not have any turnovers, but overall just did not look like the Steelers were going to be passing the football a ton. So I would sit Trubisky. Once again, I don't think many of you guys were starting Mac Jones or Trubisky, but just to be sure, I have both these quarterbacks as a sit moving into week 2. All right, Panthers at Giants. I do have Baker down as a start, but I'm not getting crazy here. Not starting Baker in most of your standard formats, but I think he's a fantastic start in super flex leagues. I had him as a start last week as well. He ended up netting you about 15 fantasy points depending on your scoring format. I have seen scoring formats where he had closer to 20 points. So I think once again, he is a solid start, but just be wary of this one. And like I said, a solid start in super flex and deeper leagues. He's a good streaming option potentially if you're really fumbling at the quarterback position overall. But listen, man, he did have the 4 fumbles, he did have an interception. So I really only like Baker in deep leagues and super flex leagues if you're absolutely desperate. I do think he could put up another decent performance in week 2. I'm going to sit Daniel Jones moving into week 2. And, you know, to be honest, if we're going to say start Baker and sit Daniel Jones, maybe it's not fair because Danny Dimes didn't have that bad of a day either in week 1 against Tennessee. Netted you about 16 fantasy points on average, 188 passing yards, 2 scores. And he did have 2 turnovers, an interception, and a fumble. But I just have the better feeling in this matchup with Baker Mayfield. I still think he has something to prove. To be fair, I think in deeper leagues, super flex leagues, you could consider Daniel Jones, but I'll leave him as a sit in a majority of leagues. And I really only like Baker if you're absolutely desperate. All right, Jets at Browns. I got 2 sits here. I got Joe Flacco as a sit. He netted you just over 15.2 fantasy points last week. He did have 59 passing attempts, which is crazy. 37 completions, 307 passing yards, and 1 touchdown through the air as well as 1 interception. I really just don't see any reason whatsoever to start Flacco moving into week 2, even in deeper leagues. Maybe if you're in a really deep super flex league and you had Dak and you're absolutely desperate, but I really don't see a reason to have Flacco in your starting lineup. When it comes to Jacoby Brissett, I feel basically the same exact Way 147 passing yards in week 1, 1 touchdown off of 34 passing attempts and 18 completions. He didn't look great. He didn't look awful. He does not look like a fantasy starter. Neither does Joe Flacco. Both these quarterbacks should not be starts moving into week 2. All right, Colts at Jags. Listen, I think Matt Ryan is a perfectly suitable streaming option. He's a perfectly suitable option if you did lose Dak in week 1. But I kind of have an asterisk here because although Matt Ryan did a lot of good things, 50 passing attempts and 32 completions for 352 passing yards and 1 score through the air, the Colts were playing from behind basically this entire game. So I just don't know if this game script is going to go the same way. And on top of that, he had 1 interception and 4 fumbles. One of those fumbles lost. So there was a lot of negativity surrounding Matty Ice in this game. But at the end of the day, the passing side of things were good enough that I do think you can consider him a start if you need to. There might be better options out there, but at the end of the day, if you have to roll with Matt Ryan, I'm not completely against it because I do think this matchup against the Jaguars is good enough. Speaking of the Jags, you have Trevor Lawrence on the other side of things. Netted you just over 14 fantasy points in week 1, 42 passing attempts, 24 completions, 275 passing yards, a score, and a fumble. So I've got him as a sit in week 2. I just don't, I mean, really, with how he performed against Washington's defense, I think the Colts defense is better. So I'm not crazy about Trevor Lawrence in week 2. Even if you're in a deeper league, super flex league, even if you lost Dak Prescott, I think there are better options overall moving into week 2. All right, Dolphins at Ravens. I'm going to sit Tua. I had Tua as a sit last week as well. He netted you just under 14 points in most scoring formats. He had 270 passing yards, 23 completions off 33 attempts, and 1 score. He had a fumble as well. I just, the performance wasn't great against New England, who I do think has quite a few holes on defense. I feel a bit better about the Ravens defense as a whole. So I think Tua, once again, is a sit for me in week 2, unless you absolutely have to start him. I mean, there's a lot of these quarterbacks, right? If you absolutely have to start him in a super flex league, I get it. But outside of that, I don't think they are viable fantasy starters in week 2 whatsoever. Lamar Jackson is definitely a viable fantasy starter in week 2 and probably every week of the season as long as he's healthy. In week 1, he netted you just over 21 fantasy points, 30 attempts, 17 completions, 213 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns. He only had 17 rushing yards. He did have an interception, but really Lamar Jackson was slinging that thing around against the Jets and really put together a couple of really good drives as well as some really good scores through the air. So I like Jackson again in week 2 against the Dolphins defense, who was impressive in week 1, but hey, if you drafted Jackson, you're starting him, and of course he's going to be a start for me in week 2. All right, Buccaneers at Saints. I think Brady, of course, even though he didn't have a great week 1 against Dallas, netted you just over 11.3 fantasy points, 27 passing attempts, 18 completions, 212 passing yards, a touchdown through the air, and an interception. I think even though he didn't have a great week 1, I mean, he's still a start for me. It's still Tom Brady, right? I think he gets back in gear, hopefully against the Saints defense. I don't know, man. I do think if you're in a league where maybe you're carrying 2 quarterbacks, potentially Brady is a sit this week because historically, Brady does not play very well against the Saints as a whole. But you kind of have a tale of 2 stories. Like if we look at last year, right, in week 8 against the Saints, he did net just over 26 fantasy points. And then in week 15, the most recent matchup, he had under 5 fantasy points. So you could argue it either way. I think if you feel like you have a better start, you could potentially roll with another quarterback. But overall, at the end of the day, for majority of fantasy rosters, Tom Brady is going to be a start if you drafted Tom Brady. All right, Jameis Winston on the other side of things. I think Winston is a great option this week if he did lose Dak in week 1 overall. 21 fantasy points for Jameis Winston in week 1, 34 passing attempts, 23 completions, 269 passing yards, and 2 scores through the airs. No turnovers for my boy Jameis. So listen, we've talked about Winston quite a few times throughout the week in terms of the waiver wire and in terms of him being a streaming option. And I really do think Jameis is a good option, a solid option overall. So if you're in need of a quarterback this week, and Jameis is hanging around, I think he's a viable start moving into week 2. Commanders at Lions. Let's give some props to my boy Carson Wentz. I told you guys last week, I thought Wentz was a beautiful start against the Jaguars. I'm really happy that this one panned out. And listen, at the end of the day, He did have 2 interceptions. He did do some Carson Wentz things, and I did tell you guys, I really like this matchup against the Jaguars. I think he's going to do some Carson Wentz things, but I do think he could put up a very solid stat line. I did not necessarily expect him to be quarterback 3 on the week, but at the end of the day, moving into week 2 against the Lions, who just gave up a ton of points to the Eagles, I think this is another good matchup for Wentz. If he lost Dak, I mean, in a league I play in, like my boy Tyler went out and already grabbed Carson Wentz right away. Like I love this start for fantasy managers who lost Dak. I think Wentz is a great stream in week 2. In week 1, he had just under 30 fantasy points, 41 passing attempts, 27 completions, 313 passing yards, 4 touchdowns. He did have 12 rushing yards, was sacked 1 time, and he did have the 2 interceptions. So there's still some Carson Wentz-esque things going on there, but at the end of the day, I like this matchup a lot for Carson Wentz. I think he could easily have 20 fantasy points in week 2 against the Lions without a doubt. All right, last week we had Jared Goff as a sit. He netted you just over 15 fantasy points as a whole, 37 passing attempts, 21 completions, 215 passing yards, 2 scores through the air, an interception, and a fumble. So I think once again against the Commanders, unless you're absolutely desperate and super flex or something, Jared Goff is a sit for me in week 2. All right, Seahawks at Niners. I've got Geno Smith as a sit. I don't want to like downplay. Geno Smith had a very good game in week 1. He came out with a victory, but wasn't necessarily a great fantasy performance. 28 passing attempts, 23 completions, 195 yards through the air, 2 scores. He did have a fumble. It was not a lost fumble, but fumble nonetheless. He had 14 rushing yards, which netted you just over 16 fantasy points. So listen, I think there are much better streaming options, much better ceilings available outside of Geno Smith, but props to Geno Smith and the Seahawks for pulling off victory against the Broncos in week 1. In terms of Trey Lance, I think you give him another chance in week 2 against the Seahawks. I mean, they played well against the Broncos defensively, but they were definitely pretty vulnerable at times. I think Trey Lance is a quarterback that if you drafted him, you did not draft a security blanket like a Derek Carr or Kirk Cousins, that you have to roll with them. That's kind of what I said all offseason. If you're going to roll with Trey Lance, you better be all in. You better be ready for some highs and some lows. And I think week 2 could be a high after week 1. You know, listen, this was the worst weather game we've seen all year long, although it's been 1 week, right? This is the worst weather game of week 1 without a doubt. It was absolutely pouring. So at the end of the day, just under 10 fantasy points on average for Trey Lance in week 1, 28 passing attempts, 13 completions, 1 interception, no passing touchdowns, 164 passing yards. He did have 54 rushing yards, which looked pretty good overall, and 1 fumble, which was not lost. He was sacked twice. So yeah, there's a lot of bad here, not as much good. But I think if you own Trey Lance, I think it's a good enough matchup that you roll with him into week 2. All right, Falcons at Rams. I've got Marcus Mariota as a sit. I'm not sure why the picture I chose for him is showing up so blurry, but nonetheless, listen, I think Mariota had a good week 1. Don't get me wrong. I'm not down on Mariota as a whole as a streaming option. He was QB 12 on the week. It's not awful by any means. I have an asterisk there because I do think if you lost Dak in week 1, you could roll with Mariota in week 2. The rushing upside is definitely there. 12 rushing attempts, 72 rushing yards, and a score on the ground. He did have 2 fumbles. One of them was lost. Through the air, no passing touchdowns, right? 33 passing attempts, 20 completions, 215 passing yards, which netted you just under 18 fantasy points. It's a solid enough stat line that I do think he could get you another 15 to 18 points in week 2. But I really am of the belief that the Rams defense is going to show up in week 2, because even though they gave up 31 points against the Bills in week 1, they still had 4 turnovers. Like, they still were a good enough unit that I think they're going to try and show up in week 2 after that huge loss in week 1. But like I said, if you need a streaming option, I still think Mariota is a streaming option. But overall, for majority of fantasy rosters, I think he's a sit in week 2. Matthew Staff infection on the other side had an awful week 1. Oh my goodness. It feels like so long ago. Thursday Night Football, first game of the season, just under 10 fantasy points, 41 passing attempts, 29 completions, 240 passing yards, a touchdown through the air, 3 interceptions, and a fumble. I do think that the Falcons defense is very different from the Bills defense, so I think that the Rams will bounce back in week 2. Do I think he's going to have a crazy game? Well, it's possible. It's definitely possible he gets you around 20 and 25 fantasy points. It is possible that we see some lower ceilings out of Matthew Stafford this season. But like I said, as a whole, I expect the Rams to bounce back in week 2 in this game against the Falcons. So I think Stafford is a start in week 2. All right, Cardinals at Raiders. I got Kyler as a start. There's no doubt about it. I get that the Cardinals did not play very good in week 1, but at the end of the day, Kyler Murray had a good fantasy day, and that is what we were looking at. He netted you just over 20.5 fantasy points, 34 passing attempts, 22 completions, 193 yards through the air, 2 scores, 29 yards on the ground, no turnovers, most importantly for Kyler. So he still had a very good day, and I like this matchup against the Raiders. They looked very vulnerable against the Chargers as a whole, so I like this matchup. I like Kyler in week 2, and if you drafted Kyler, you're starting Kyler. Let's be realistic. All right, Derek Carr is also a start for me, but you just have to kind of tamper your expectations. Like, if you drafted Carr, you win 0 QB, you know what you're getting, right? Like, you're hoping for 18 fantasy points. Oh, there's still a lot of reasons to believe that the Raiders have a lot of upside on that offense. It just didn't really show in week 1. Carr is kind of ultra aggressive. He did throw 3 interceptions and he had 2 fumbles. Like, if you take away the turnovers, he had a pretty good day overall through the air. 37 passing attempts, 22 completions, 295 passing yards, and 2 scores. So I do think he could bounce back as well, but he's really got to fix the turnovers. At the end of the day, if you don't have a better option, I do think he's a start. I do like this game script overall for both quarterbacks moving into week 2. All right, Texans at Broncos. I'm sitting Davis Mills. There's no disrespect because I'm still a big fan of Mills, and I do think in the right formats, very deep super flex leagues or whatever, you could consider starting Davis Mills. But I do think that the Broncos defense is going to play a little bit better than they did in week 1. But really, when you look at that week 1 matchup against the Seahawks, they didn't play great in the first half. They played very well in the second half, though, so I'm a little bit worried. I wouldn't get too excited. Overall, I think that makes Mills a sit. He did have 37 passing attempts, 23 completions, 240 passing yards, 2 scores, and he had 1 fumble, which was a lost fumble. So that netted you about 15 fantasy points on average. Not an awful performance whatsoever by Davis Mills. And like I said, I like Davis Mills, don't get me wrong, but just from a fantasy perspective, I don't think he's a start here in week 2. Russell Wilson, I do think is a start in week 2. Listen, I know he's kind of got like a rainy cloud hovering over him coming off of his revenge game that he lost. I mean, in the Seahawks stadium. Just there's a lot to get into there, but I think going up against the Texans, who did play well defensively against the Colts in week 1, he's still a start. Like, if you drafted Russell Wilson, he is still a starter on your roster. Netted you just under 18 fantasy points, 42 passing attempts, 29 completions, 340 passing yards, and a score. No turnovers for Russ in week 1. And you just got to think, like, if you took, a couple of those goal line drives, those times when they were in the red zone, if Russ just threw 1 more touchdown, he would have netted you over 20 fantasy points. So really, I kind of look at that game, and I think it had more to do with the coaching than it had to do with Russell Wilson. So I would keep faith in Russell Wilson and the Broncos in that receiving core, that run game, tight end game. I mean, there were some explosive plays for this offense. So I definitely have Russell Wilson as a starter moving into week 2. All right, Bengals at Cowboys. Wow, what a tale of 2 halves for Joe Burrow. Looked absolutely terrifying if you started him in the first half. 4 interceptions, 2 fumbles, a lost fumble in this game. I mean, Burrow's my guy, but he came back and redeemed himself. With all of that said, he still had over 20 fantasy points on average. 53 passing attempts, 33 completions, 338 passing yards, and 2 scores. He also had 47 rushing yards. The thing that I really liked in this game, although it ended up being a loss for the Bengals, was just how poised and how calm Joe Burrow seemed to me throughout the entire game, and how unafraid he was to target guys like Jamar Chase when the game was on the line. I really thought that last score before overtime when he threw to Jamar Chase, I really did not expect that to be a missed extra point. I really thought that was a walk-off touchdown. And I think Burrow thought the same exact thing. But nonetheless, football, real-life football aside, this was a good fantasy performance, even with 4 interceptions and 2 fumbles. So I think without a doubt against the Cowboys, he is a starter for you in week 2. All right, I would sit Cooper Rush. Let's see how he performs with Dak out. There is some possibility for some streaming down the stretch, but Cooper Rush is a sit until we know what this offense looks like, until we have a larger sample size as a whole. We did see him perform pretty well last year in place of Dak, but let's give it some time. Let's see what happens. Let's see how things look before we get too crazy and throw Cooper Rush into any starting lineups. All right, Bears at Packers. I've got Justin Fields as a sit. He netted you just under 15 fantasy points, 121 passing yards through the air, 2 scores and interception. Don't get me wrong, like, this is a pretty good game for Justin Fields. He seemed pretty poised. Super rainy game, was, like we mentioned earlier, an awful weather game. And at the end of the day, the Bears came out victorious. It was a decent game. He had 28 rushing yards on the ground as well. But I just feel like the Green Bay Packers defense is going to show up big in week 2. If you absolutely need a streaming option and Fields is the best you got, I don't hate him. And I do think he's going to have moments throughout the season where he is a viable streaming option. But you know, at the end of the day, I just don't think he holds a crazy high ceiling moving into week 2. All right, I would start Aaron Rodgers, but let's be a little bit hesitant here. I mean, I still liked him in week 1 against Minnesota. I expected that game to go very, very differently. And let's face it, the Packers had a very bad day. Aaron Rodgers was, if I'm not mistaken, the worst performing starting quarterback in all of fantasy in week 1. I don't even think it was close. He netted you under 4 fantasy points. 34 passing attempts, 22 completions, 195 passing yards, no touchdowns, an interception, and a lost fumble. The receivers just did not look like they were clicking with Aaron Rodgers. But with that being said, week 1 went very, very bad last year for the Packers against the Saints, although they did have Devontae Adams. I don't know. There's a lot to look at here, but I do think that Rodgers and the Packers will bounce back against the Bears. Don't get me wrong. You know, I'm not counting out the Bears in this matchup, but I think at the end of the day, let's not doubt Aaron Rodgers. If he is your starting quarterback, he didn't pick up any streaming options, then roll with him and have some faith. But if we don't see improvement in the next 4 weeks, there is no reason to panic on this offense. But with just 1 game under the belt in the season, let's not panic quite yet. I would put Rodgers as a starter moving into week 2. All right, Titans at Bills. I would sit Ryan Tannehill, although he had a pretty decent game in week 1. Just over 19 fantasy points, 20 completions off 33 attempts, 266 passing yards, 2 touchdowns. He had no turnovers, you know, and this was against the Giants, though. So for me, like, if you need to start Tannehill in super flex leagues or deeper leagues, I'm not against it because he had a decent week 1. I mean, he actually had a pretty good week 1. Let's give him some credit. But that Bills defense looks good, man. I just don't love him in this matchup. And I do think that the Titans are going to try and establish the run game pretty early on. So I don't know. You could see a game script here where the Titans are behind. They start throwing more. And that could be good or bad for Ryan Tannehill. I just think overall, he's better off as a set outside of Superflex formats. Obviously, you're starting Josh Allen. There's no doubt about it whatsoever. We don't really need to go into it. Let's just read his stat line for week 1. Just over 33.4 fantasy points. QB2 on the week. 31 passing attempts, 26 completions, 297 passing yards, 3 touchdowns, 56 rushing yards off 10 rushing attempts. He was sacked twice. He did throw 2 interceptions. If he did not have those interceptions, he probably would have been QB1 on the week. Nonetheless, he had a monster performance. Did not matter that he threw interceptions at all. And really, with the amount he's going to be throwing the ball this year, you have to expect some interceptions. But at the end of the day, Josh Allen's a start. Let's move right along. All right, Vikings at Eagles. Captain, you like that. Kirk Cousins had just over 19 fantasy points in week 1. 32 passing attempts, 23 completions, 277 passing yards, and 2 scores. This wasn't really a game against the Packers where the Vikings had to do much, so we just kind of threw it up to Justin Jefferson a couple times, and the Vikings were able to call it a day. And listen, this is really the type of ceiling and floor you'll probably see out of Kirk Cousins on a weekly basis. This is why he's one of the best late-round selections moving into the year. He just is a safe quarterback, somewhere between 17 and 20 fantasy points on a weekly basis. And I do think that in this game against the Eagles, we could see a better ceiling overall because I think the Eagles are going to keep this thing competitive and score a lot of points. I think that on the other hand, the Vikings are going to do everything they can to keep up. So I like Kirk Cousins in week 2, and I love Jalen Hurts, your QB4 on the week. You guys know I love Jalen Hurts all off season. Just under 25 fantasy points in week 1 against the Lions, 32 passing attempts, 18 completions, 243 passing yards, not throw any touchdowns, but he had 17 rushing attempts for 90 yards and 1 touchdown on the ground. That is where Jalen Hurts holds a majority of his fantasy value. I like this game script once again in week 2. Then he gets Washington, then Jacksonville, then Arizona. I mean, Jalen Hurts, I think, is going to have another monster start to the season. He's going to be a must start on a weekly basis until further notice. That'll do it for today's video. If you guys did enjoy the content today, be sure to hit that like button on the way out, hit that subscribe button. Of course, if you're new to the channel, we put out free daily fantasy football content. We would love to help you dominate your fantasy league this year. And be sure to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. If you guys need help adjusting your roster for the week, if you guys have drops or trades, waiver thoughts, anything you guys need, let me know. I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, y'all saw it here on The Catch.